The Fear Factory Stories.
Sometimes the familiar can turn into something terrifying without warning. I always thought of my office as a safe, predictable place. Until one night, I realized just how wrong I was. I work at a small marketing firm in Chicago, a modest office on the 12th floor of an old downtown building. Most days are filled with the hum of conversation, the tapping of keyboards, and the ringing of phones. But at night, when everyone has gone home, it's a different place. The silence is thick, almost suffocating, and that night, I found myself alone, finishing a project that was due first thing in the morning. It was almost 10 p.m., and the office was empty, except for the faint buzz of the overhead lights and the hum of the air conditioning. I had been working late more often than usual, but something about this night felt different. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier. I told myself it was just fatigue, the stress of the deadline getting to me. I was staring at my computer screen, reviewing the final report, when I first noticed it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, just a blur, a shadow darting across the reflection in my monitor. I turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. My heart skipped a beat, and I laughed nervously to myself, shaking it off as just a trick of the light. But then, a few moments later, it happened again, a dark shape moving in the far corner of the office. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the room was dim, lit only by the soft glow from the streetlights outside. The shadow seemed to pool in one spot, darker and more concentrated than it should have been. I tried to go back to my work, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting back to that corner. It was like a spot of ink spreading across a blank page, slowly expanding. I could feel my pulse quicken. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd been staring at the screen too long, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. I decided to get up and take a walk, maybe grab a cup of coffee from the kitchenette down the hall. As I stood, I felt a chill run down my spine, the air growing colder with each step. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing softly in the empty office. I turned the corner, and there it was, again. That same dark shadow, still and heavy, like it was waiting for me. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real, and it seemed to move, almost pulse with its own energy. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, a loud, steady thump. I took a step closer, my curiosity battling with my fear. The shadow seemed to stretch, its edges blurring, reaching out as if to touch me. The air grew even colder. I could see my breath in small, misty puffs in front of me. I wanted to run, but I felt rooted to the spot, unable to move, my eyes locked on the shifting mass of darkness. I felt a deep sense of dread, like something was terribly wrong. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow flickered and vanished. The office felt normal again, the air warming slightly, but I was left shaken. My hands were trembling as I quickly gathered my things, my only thought being to get out of there. I hurried to the elevator, pressing the button repeatedly, as if that would make it come faster. When the doors finally opened, I rushed inside, my heart still racing. As the elevator descended, I tried to make sense of what I had seen, but nothing made any logical sense. I told myself I'd been overworking, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But even as I walked to my car, the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking in the shadows, lingered. I drove home with my hands gripping the wheel tightly, the events of the night replaying over and over in my mind. I haven't stayed late at the office since. I don't know what was there that night, and I don't care to find out. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was waiting for me, hidden in the shadows, watching. Some customers are stranger than others, but I never thought delivering a pizza would put me face to face with real danger. I've been delivering pizzas for a couple of years now, and usually it's a pretty straightforward gig. But there was one customer, Mr. Parker, who always stood out. Every Wednesday night, without fail, he'd order the same thing, a large pepperoni pizza with extra cheese. He lived in a rundown house on the outskirts of Cleveland, surrounded by a thick patch of woods that made the place feel more like a hideout than a home. I rarely saw Mr. Parker. He kept to himself, always. Instead of coming to the door, he used this old rope and pulley system that ran from his porch to the driveway. I'd put the pizza on a tray attached to the rope, and he'd pull it up from inside. It was weird, but that was just Mr. Parker's routine. But one particular Wednesday evening was different. I got a call from Mr. Parker himself. That was odd. He usually ordered online, but this time he wanted 2 pizzas. His voice sounded strange, shaky almost, like he was nervous. He insisted I still use the rope system. Something in his tone made me uneasy, like he was trying to hide something, but I shrugged it off, thinking maybe he had a friend over or something. I drove out to his house, the familiar winding road through the trees almost comforting at this point. As I approached, the house came into view with its dim porch light barely cutting through the thick darkness. But something was off. The rope wasn't hanging down like it usually was. It was always ready, waiting for the pizza. I hesitated by my car, pizzas in hand, staring at the silent house. The whole place felt wrong, too quiet. I walked slowly toward the porch, expecting the rope to drop down at any moment. But it didn't. The house seemed to loom over me, dark and still, like it was watching. Then I saw movement, a shadow in the basement window. I stopped dead in my tracks. A figure, masked and crouched low, moved quickly out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest. Something was terribly wrong. I edged closer to the side of the house, trying to get a better look through the basement window. The window was cracked open, and I could see several more masked figures moving around inside. My hands started to shake as I fumbled for my phone. I called the police, stuttering out the words as I explained that there were intruders in Mr. Parker's house. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but those few minutes felt like an eternity. I backed away from the house, still clutching the pizzas. I didn't want to leave Mr. Parker in there, but I knew I couldn't just run in and try to save him myself. I was rooted to the spot, staring at the basement window. When I saw it, the masked figures were dragging something heavy. My stomach twisted as I realized it was Mr. Parker. They had him tied up with ropes, his frail body struggling weakly. I watched in horror as they beat him, their fists pounding against his body. Each blow made me flinch, my skin crawling with fear. I felt completely helpless, just standing there, waiting for the police. Finally, the flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. The officers arrived and quickly surrounded the house. I watched, my heart racing, as they stormed inside. I heard shouting, the sounds of a struggle, and then saw the masked figures being led out in handcuffs. There were 3 of them, dressed all in black, their faces hidden behind featureless masks. Finally, the flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. The officers arrived and quickly surrounded the house. I watched, my heart racing, as they stormed inside. I heard shouting, the sounds of a struggle, and then saw the masked figures being led out in handcuffs. There were 3 of them, dressed all in black, their faces hidden behind featureless masks. As the police led Mr. Parker out, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was mixed with horror. He was alive, but barely. His face was swollen and bruised, his body covered in cuts and scratches. The ropes had left deep marks on his wrists and ankles, and he could hardly stand. The paramedics rushed him to the ambulance, and the police took the intruders away. But the air was thick with mystery. Why had they attacked Mr. Parker? There was no sign of a break-in, no demand for money or valuables. It seemed like they were there just to hurt him, to break him for no reason. Later that night, I went to visit Mr. Parker in the hospital. He was hooked up to machines, his body covered in bandages. He looked so small in that hospital bed, like a child. I didn't know what to say, but he gave me a weak smile. "If you hadn't called, I don't know what would have happened," he whispered. A shiver ran down my spine as I thought about what I'd seen. The masked figures, the violence, the way they dragged him around like a rag doll. Why did they do this? What could Mr. Parker have done to deserve such cruelty? The police never found out their motive. The intruders wouldn't say a word, not even after they were arrested. It was as if they had come just to terrorize an old man for the thrill of it. No explanation, no reason. To this day, every Wednesday when I drive by Mr. Parker's house, I still think about that night. The memory of those masked faces haunts me. The fear in Mr. Parker's eyes. The sound of fists hitting flesh. The helplessness I felt. It's all burned into my mind, and I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, someone is still watching, waiting for their next victim. There's something about the deep, dark woods at night that makes you feel utterly alone, but also strangely watched. I learned this the hard way on a camping trip I'll never forget. It was close to 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over gravel. My friend Jack and I had set up camp in a remote part of the Great Smoky Mountains, far from any signs of life. We were miles away from the nearest town, somewhere off an old logging road that we thought no one else would dare to travel. We hadn't seen a soul since we started hiking that afternoon. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding. I nudged Jack awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, trying to steady my voice. He blinked a few times, still groggy but alert enough to listen. The sound grew louder, and a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping over our tents like a searchlight. A car, out here, at this hour. It made no sense. The car rolled past us, and for a brief moment I thought that would be the end of it. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it came back. "What do you think they want?" Jack muttered, his voice tight with worry. I shook my head. I had no answers. We sat there, paralyzed by the tension, as the car sat idling. The engine purred softly, but the longer it stayed, the more my nerves were on edge. Then, with a creak that echoed in the stillness, the driver's side door swung open. A tall, shadowy figure stepped out. He just stood there, framed by the bright lights, before starting to walk toward us. His footsteps were slow and heavy, deliberate, crunching over the gravel with a rhythm that seemed almost rehearsed. My breath caught in my throat. The man didn't say a word. He just kept moving closer, circling our campsite like he was deciding what to do next. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the low rumble of the car's engine. I could see the outline of his boots as he walked, just inches from my tent flap. I wanted to shout, to tell him to go away, but my voice wouldn't come. I felt Jack's hand grip my arm, his fingers digging in. We both held our breath, not daring to make a sound. The man continued to circle, his shadow flickering in the headlights, like a ghost haunting the woods. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped, right outside my tent. I could hear him breathing, slow and steady, like he was in no rush at all. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where? We were miles from help, in the middle of the forest, with no cell signal. I stayed frozen, every muscle tense, waiting for his next move. And then, just like that, he turned and walked back to his car. The door creaked again, and I heard the engine rev up. The headlights shifted, and slowly, the car turned around and drove away, swallowed by the darkness once more. I didn't move. I couldn't, not for a long time. I stayed in my tent, listening to my heartbeat pounding in my ears, wondering if he'd come back. The night felt colder. The shadows seemed deeper. I didn't sleep at all. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. When dawn finally broke, I felt a rush of relief, but the fear still clung to me like a second skin. We packed up in silence, neither of us saying much. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those headlights again. I'll never know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'll always remember the way the woods felt that night. Dark, foreboding, and full of secrets. Home is supposed to be a place of comfort and safety. I never imagined that coming back for Christmas break would make me feel so exposed and afraid in my own house. It was a frosty December evening, just a week before Christmas. I had just wrapped up my last final exam of the semester and couldn't wait to get home for the holidays. My parents were away visiting my aunt in Chicago for a few days, so I'd have the house all to myself, a perfect time to unwind after the stress of finals, or so I thought. As I pulled into the driveway of our home in a quiet suburb outside of Indianapolis, the cold winter air bit at my face. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way to the front door. The house was dark and still, an unusual sight. Normally it would be filled with warmth and light, but tonight it felt strangely empty. Knowing I'd be alone for the next few days gave me a little unease, but I shrugged it off. After the chaos of college life, I was looking forward to the peace and quiet. I stepped inside, flicked on the lights, and locked the door behind me. The warmth of the house slowly thawed my face and fingers, and I immediately felt a bit more relaxed. I dropped my bag near the entryway and headed upstairs to my room. I tossed my jacket on the bed, feeling the weight of the semester slowly lift off my shoulders. I decided that a hot shower would be the perfect way to start my break. After my shower, I wandered down to the kitchen in my socks, enjoying the feel of the soft carpet turning to cold tiles beneath my feet. The house was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I reheated some leftover pasta from the fridge and sat down at the kitchen table, savoring every bite, each one a small victory over the stress of the last few weeks. After eating, I headed back to the living room where my Xbox waited for me. I powered it on, grabbed my controller, and put on my headset. The familiar startup sound filled the room, and I felt myself starting to relax on the couch. I got lost in the game for a good hour, letting the stress of exams melt away. Then suddenly, a loud thud from upstairs snapped me back to reality. I froze, my fingers hovering over the controller. At first I thought it might be something falling, maybe a book or a picture frame that had been precariously perched. I tried to dismiss it and went back to my game. But then it happened again, another thud, even louder this time. The sound reverberated through the ceiling directly above me, coming from my bedroom. My heart began to race. I was alone in the house. There shouldn't have been any noise coming from upstairs. I felt a chill run down my spine, and my heartbeat quickened. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. I stood there for a moment, controller still in hand, debating whether to go upstairs and check. My instincts screamed at me to stay put. What if someone was in the house? What if it wasn't just something falling over? My legs felt weak as I moved across the room, locking the living room door behind me. My hands were trembling as I turned the key, trying to steady my breathing. The noise had been so sudden, so out of place that my mind went immediately to the worst-case scenario. Someone had broken in. I crept over to the window and peeked outside. My breath fogged up the glass as I scanned the street. Everything was still. Snow was gently falling, and there were no signs of life. No cars, no people. The whole world seemed frozen in time. But upstairs, something had definitely moved. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911, my hands shaking. I tried to keep my voice steady as I told the dispatcher that I thought someone was in my house. They assured me officers were on their way, but the minutes felt like hours. I could hear my own breathing, loud in the silence, every creak of the house making me jump. My eyes were fixed on the door, every fiber of my being focused on listening for the slightest sound. Any second now, whoever or whatever was upstairs could come down. Finally, I heard a car pull up outside, and flashing blue and red lights illuminated the room. Relief washed over me. The police were here. I let the officers in, still trembling. One of them immediately went upstairs while the other stayed with me, asking questions. My mind was racing, trying to comprehend what was happening. About 15 minutes later, the officer came back downstairs. His face was calm, but his words sent another wave of fear through me. "Someone's broken in," he said. "The window in your bedroom is open, and it looks like they came in through there." I felt a wave of nausea. I knew I had locked all the doors and windows before leaving for my final that morning. Someone had forced their way in, into my home, into my private space. "It doesn't seem like they took anything," the officer continued. "They might have left in a hurry when they heard you come in." I swallowed hard, the reality of the situation sinking in. Those thuds weren't random noises. It was someone. Someone had been in my house, possibly watching me, waiting, and I had been blissfully unaware, playing my game downstairs. The police searched the rest of the house and found no one. They suggested I stay somewhere else for the night, just to be safe. But I refused. This was my home. I didn't want to leave. But after they left, and I locked the door behind them, I realized that my sense of security was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my room while I was downstairs. The thought haunted me, even after the police left. My home, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt invaded and unsafe. There are moments when the familiar comfort of home can turn into a trap, a place where fear sneaks in, unnoticed. It happened to me one cold November night, a night I thought would be just like any other. My name is Sarah, and I've been living alone for nearly 3 years now. My husband, John, is a Marine, stationed overseas in Okinawa. I've grown used to the solitude, the quiet nights, and the empty spaces in our small house in Charlotte, North Carolina. My dog, Rex, a large, fiercely loyal German shepherd, is my only companion. His presence makes me feel secure, or at least it did until that night. It was a Friday, just after Thanksgiving, and I was finishing up cleaning the dishes. The house was quiet. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. Outside, the wind was picking up, rustling the leaves on the trees, making branches scrape against the windows like skeletal fingers. I shrugged off the noise. I'd grown accustomed to all the sounds that come with living alone. Rex lay on the kitchen floor, his eyes half closed, but suddenly he lifted his head, ears perked up, and a deep growl rumbled from his chest. I froze, my heart beginning to race. "What is it, boy?" I asked softly, though I didn't expect an answer. Then I heard it. Faint footsteps on the gravel outside, crunching slowly, deliberately. A chill ran down my spine. Rex was on his feet now, barking furiously, his body tense, facing the front door. I moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just a fraction to peer outside. The porch light cast a weak, flickering glow, but I saw nothing. Yet Rex kept barking, pacing back and forth, his tail stiff, his gaze locked on the door. I tried to tell myself it was probably just the wind or a stray cat. "Come on, Rex. It's nothing," I muttered, trying to calm both of us. I turned off the lights downstairs and headed to my bedroom upstairs, with Rex following close behind, still on alert. Once in my room, I felt a bit more at ease. I locked the bedroom door, closed the curtains tight, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I climbed into bed, listening to the faint howl of the wind outside. willing myself to relax. Slowly, I drifted into a light sleep. But hours later, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My eyes flew open, my heart hammering in my chest. Rex was barking again, more aggressively than before. My blood ran cold. I heard the front door creak open, the wind rushing through, and then slow, heavy footsteps moving inside my house. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. "Please help," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone is in my house." I pressed my back against the bedroom door, feeling the solid wood, praying it would hold. Rex stood beside me, his growl low and menacing. I could hear the footsteps downstairs, moving room to room, as if whoever was there knew exactly where they were headed. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, the seconds ticking by like hours. Then silence. Moments later, I heard sirens approaching, getting louder, closer. Relief washed over me, but fear still gripped me tight. I could hear the police shouting outside, commanding the intruder to come out. I stayed locked in my room, too terrified to move. Finally, there was a knock on my bedroom door. "Ma'am, it's the police. You're safe now." I opened the door cautiously, my hands shaking. Rex rushed out, barking, but quickly calmed when he saw the officers. They assured me they had arrested a man downstairs. I followed them to the living room, my legs weak, barely able to walk. The front door was broken, hanging off its hinges. My house, my safe haven, felt invaded, like a stranger's place. Through the window, I could see the man sitting in the back of a squad car, his face twisted with a wild grin that sent chills down my spine. One of the officers turned to me, his face serious. "Ma'am," he said, "this man has been following you for weeks. He knew your husband was away, that you were living alone. He had plans to rob you." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. My knees felt weak, and I gripped the wall to steady myself. This man had been watching me, waiting, learning my routines. The thought of it made my skin crawl. I looked around at the house, now filled with police. It no longer felt like home. The shadows seemed darker, the rooms colder. The idea that someone had been stalking me, planning to break in, filled me with a fear I had never known before. I've been living alone for a while now, but that night changed everything. My home isn't the same. The sense of safety I once felt is gone, replaced by the unsettling realization that I had never been alone at all. It was late, and the road ahead seemed to stretch into eternity, swallowed by the darkness of a moonless night. I had just left my friend Mike's place in Albuquerque, driving back home to Flagstaff. The highway was empty, the only sound being the hum of my engine and the occasional whisper of the wind through the desert shrubs. There's something comforting about driving alone at night, a sense of solitude that I've always enjoyed. But that night, everything changed. I glanced down at the dashboard and felt a jolt of panic. The fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty. How could I have been so careless? I tried to remember the last gas station I'd passed, but it was miles behind me now, too far to turn back. The car began to sputter, the engine struggling as if gasping for breath. Within moments, it rolled to a complete stop on the shoulder of Route 66, leaving me surrounded by nothing but the vast desert and an unnerving silence. I felt a chill run down my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. I quickly locked the doors and reached for my phone, praying I had enough signal to call for help. I had just enough bars to try dialing for a tow truck, and while I waited, I kept scanning the road, hoping for headlights, for any sign of life. But there was nothing, just darkness and more darkness. Minutes ticked by like hours. I tried to calm myself by listening to the wind, but the silence was suffocating. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Two figures were emerging from the shadows of the desert, walking toward my car. My heart raced. I could make out their faces now under the dim glow of the moon. They looked rough, disheveled, as if they'd been wandering for days. One of them raised his hand and knocked on my window. "Help us," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. Every instinct in me screamed to keep the doors locked. Something about them didn't feel right. Their eyes were wide, desperate, almost predatory. The second man grabbed the door handle, yanking at it. My hands trembled as I dialed 911, explaining my situation as quietly as possible, afraid they might hear me. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but I couldn't shake the fear that gripped me. What if they broke in before the police arrived? The men kept knocking, their hands smearing the windows as they pressed against the glass. I tried to avoid their gaze, focusing instead on the blinking signal bars on my phone. Time dragged on, every second stretching into an eternity, until finally I saw the blue and red lights flashing in the distance. Relief washed over me as the police cruiser pulled up behind my car. The men took a few steps back, retreating toward the shadows. The officers approached, asking if I was okay. I nodded, but my heart was still pounding in my chest. "We'll check it out," one of the officers said, shining a flashlight toward the desert where the men had vanished. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The officers called out to the men, and after a tense moment, they stepped back into the light. This time they seemed different, less aggressive, more defeated. They explained something to the police, and I rolled down my window slightly to hear what was going on. Their voices were shaky, filled with fear. They weren't trying to rob me. They were running from something far worse. The officer turned back to me, his face serious. "These men's families were attacked by a group of robbers," he explained. "They've been hiding in the desert, trying to escape. The robbers are still out there." A chill ran through me. I hadn't been in danger from the men at my car, but from the criminals they were fleeing. The officers quickly called for backup, and within minutes more police cars arrived. They led the men to safety, while a group of officers with flashlights disappeared into the desert to search for the robbers. I sat in my car, sweat clinging to my skin despite the cool night air. The idea of those dangerous men lurking somewhere in the dark desert made my heart pound even harder. Before long, the police found them. The robbers were hiding deeper in the desert, their faces hard and cruel as they were led out in handcuffs. The officers helped me out of my car, reassuring me that it was safe now. As I stood there on the side of Route 66, watching the flashing lights and the deep, dark desert beyond, I felt a chill run down my spine. The night that had once felt so peaceful had turned into something terrifying. The police thanked me for staying calm, but I didn't feel calm at all. I just wanted to get home, to leave that dark, empty highway behind. As I got back into my car, now refueled by the officers, I took one last look at the desert, its shadows still deep and endless. I drove away, hoping never to find myself stranded in such darkness again. You think you know someone until you find yourself hiding from their secrets in the middle of the night. Back in college, I rented a small, rundown house just off the edge of the campus in Austin, Texas. It wasn't much, but the rent was cheap, and it was home for me and my roommate, Josh. We were both broke college kids, scraping by with part-time jobs and student loans, always a few dollars short. Josh was a decent guy, quiet and kept to himself most of the time. But he had some friends who always made me feel uneasy. I never knew much about his life outside our house, but one friend, in particular, gave me a bad vibe. His name was Kyle. I'd met him a couple of times before. He wasn't the kind of guy you'd want to hang out with. Always twitchy, constantly glancing over his shoulder like he was looking for someone or something. He had this unpredictable energy, like he could explode at any moment. But Josh seemed to trust him, so I never said much. Maybe I should have. It was around 1 a.m. on a Thursday night. I was in my room, trying to finish a paper, when I heard heavy footsteps above. The sound made me pause. I could hear Josh's voice, muffled but anxious, talking to someone. It wasn't unusual for him to have people over, but something about the tone of his voice sent a shiver down my spine. Then I heard another voice, Kyle's. I hadn't seen him in weeks, but as soon as I heard him speak, my stomach dropped. His words were rushed, frantic even, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. I could hear the floorboards creaking as they moved around upstairs. Then, without warning, the door to the basement slammed open. Our basement was a cold, dark hole. Nobody ever went down there unless we had to. The concrete floor was cracked, and the wooden beams above groaned with every step. The air was thick with the smell of mold and mildew. Just thinking about someone being down there made my skin crawl. I left my room quietly and moved toward the staircase, trying not to make any noise. From the top of the stairs, I could hear them more clearly now. Their voices were tense, urgent. I inched closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "Just for a few days," Josh said, his voice shaky. "I can't stay out there," Kyle replied. "The cops are everywhere, man. They're looking for me. I need a place to lay low." I felt my breath catch. The cops? What had Kyle done? My mind raced, but I didn't have to wait long to find out. "I didn't mean to shoot them, okay?" Kyle hissed, his voice full of panic and anger. It was supposed to be quick, in and out. But they fought back, and I panicked. I didn't mean to kill them. The words hit me like a truck. Kyle had killed 2 people during a robbery, and now he was hiding in our house. I could feel my hands trembling as I gripped the banister. I needed to get out of there, call the police, do something. But fear kept me frozen in place. The basement door creaked open again, and I heard Kyle's heavy footsteps descending into the darkness. He was going down to hide in that cold, damp basement. I turned and quietly hurried back to my room, closing the door behind me as silently as possible. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. What the hell had Josh gotten us into? A murderer was hiding just a few feet below, and Josh was helping him. I sat on my bed, trying to steady my breathing and think. If Kyle found out I knew, what would he do? And Josh, how could he be a part of this? I felt trapped in my own house. The next few days were unbearable. Josh was quieter than usual, barely making eye contact, pretending like everything was fine. But I knew better. Every creak in the floor, every rustle outside made me jump. I could feel Kyle's presence beneath me, lurking in the basement like a shadow waiting to strike. At night, I barely slept. The thought of Kyle creeping up the stairs in the dark was suffocating. I imagined him sneaking through the house, slipping into my room. The tension was so thick, it felt like the walls were closing in on me. Then one night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up from the basement stairs. My heart stopped. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, listening. The footsteps got closer and closer, then suddenly stopped right at the top of the stairs. I held my breath, waiting for the door to creak open, but it didn't. The footsteps slowly retreated back down into the dark. That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear and uncertainty were eating me alive. I had to do something. Early the next morning, when Josh was still asleep, I grabbed my phone and snuck outside. I called the police, my voice barely a whisper, telling them everything I knew. They arrived quickly, surrounding the house, weapons drawn, moving in with precision. Josh stood there in shock, his face pale as they stormed inside. I watched from the front yard, my heart racing, as they headed for the basement. Kyle didn't go down without a fight. I heard shouting, the sounds of a struggle, and then finally saw him being dragged out in handcuffs. His face was pale, eyes wide with anger and fear. He shot me a look as they shoved him into the squad car, a look that sent chills down my spine, a look that said this wasn't over. Josh moved out the following week. We barely spoke after that. The house felt hollow, even after Kyle was gone. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had left something behind in that basement. Something dark and cold that would never truly leave. To this day, I still think about that week, the moment I realized how close I'd come to real danger. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the house is quiet, I swear I can still hear those footsteps on the basement stairs. You never think it could happen to you until it does. That night, I learned how quickly an ordinary evening can turn into something terrifying. When I was 16, skateboarding was my entire world. It was my escape, my passion, and the way I felt truly free. On weekends, my friends and I would skate through the streets of Portland until the sun dipped below the horizon. Those were some of the best days of my youth. The wind in my face, the wheels grinding on the pavement, and the sound of our laughter echoing through the city. But one particular Saturday night stands out in my memory, and not for the reasons you might think. It started like any other, with my friends and me skating downtown, showing off our latest tricks and pushing each other to be better. As the night wore on, people began heading home one by one. Eventually, I realized it was getting late, probably around 11 p.m., and decided it was time to leave. I said my goodbyes and hopped on the bus that would take me close to home. My friends didn't live along the bus route I was taking, so I ended up riding alone, gazing out the window at the blur of city lights as we sped through the streets. The city was still bustling, but there was something about the night that made everything feel strangely quiet and empty, like the calm before a storm. I got off at my stop on Main Street, about a 2-minute walk from my house in a quieter neighborhood of the city. As I stepped off the bus, it felt like the noise of the city disappeared behind me. I started walking toward home, the only sound being the soft thud of my sneakers against the pavement. The air was cool, and a light breeze rustled the leaves in the trees lining the street. As I approached the intersection where Main Street met my own, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A figure appeared, emerging from a narrow alleyway near the elementary school. It was a man on a bike, and he seemed to materialize out of the shadows as if the night itself had summoned him. I knew that alley well. It led down to a small park near a creek, a place I often skated by during the day. But seeing someone come from there at this hour made me uneasy. My instincts kicked in immediately. Something was off. It wasn't unusual to see people out late, but there was something about this man that made my stomach tighten with anxiety. He didn't belong there, not at this hour, not on this street. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread, but it clung to me like a shadow. As I walked, I noticed he started pedaling faster. Then I heard him shout, "Hey!" His voice cut through the stillness, sending a jolt of fear through me. This wasn't just some passerby. My heart began to race as adrenaline surged through my veins. I was close to home, but I didn't want to lead him there. My home was my sanctuary, the place where I felt safe, and I wasn't about to bring this potential threat anywhere near it. I kept walking, trying to maintain my composure, but my mind was spinning, trying to calculate my next move. He was getting closer, and within moments he caught up to me, stopping his bike in front of the school, blocking my path. I could feel my breath catch in my throat as I sized him up. He was tall and muscular, much bigger than me. I was just a skinny kid, and he looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s, which only made the situation more intimidating. Why was a grown man following a teenager down a dark street at this hour? He asked where I was going. His voice slurred like he might have been drinking. Something about him was off, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shot back with a snarky comment, trying to mask my fear with false bravado. I told him it didn't matter where I was going, hoping my attitude would deter him from pushing further. But instead of backing off, he leaned in closer and asked if I wanted to go behind the school and hang out with him. His words sent a chill down my spine. The thought of being alone with this stranger in a dark, deserted area filled me with terror. I thought about using my skateboard as a weapon, but I wasn't sure if I could defend myself against someone his size. What if I missed? What if I only made him angrier? Desperate, I tried to call 911, but the line was busy. Panic surged through me. and I gripped my skateboard tighter, my knuckles turning white. I was running out of options, and my mind was spiraling into worst-case scenarios. Could I outrun him? Would anyone hear me if I screamed? I considered banging on doors and shouting for help, but the houses around me were dark and silent. I felt completely alone, trapped in this nightmare with no way out. Frantically scanning the street for any sign of help, I spotted an older woman walking on the other side, about 70 feet away. She was like a beacon of hope in the darkness. Without thinking, I bolted toward her, shouting for help. The man on the bike followed me, but I didn't care. I needed to reach her fast. When I got to her, I begged for her assistance, my voice shaking with fear. She seemed frightened by the sudden approach of two strangers in the middle of the night and told me to leave her alone. I noticed she had an accent, and on a hunch I asked if she spoke Polish, a language I had picked up from my grandparents. When she replied yes, it felt like a lifeline. I quickly explained the situation in Polish, my words tumbling out in a rush. The moment she understood, her demeanor changed. She softened, and for the first time that night, I felt a sliver of hope. The woman urged me to call 911 again. I told her about the busy line earlier, and she insisted I try once more. As I reached for my phone, I noticed the man on the bike backing off. He muttered something about not wanting any trouble before turning and pedaling away toward the park, disappearing into the darkness. My heart was still pounding, but the immediate threat was gone. I eventually got through to 911 and reported the incident. The police assured me they would search the area, but when they called back later, they said they hadn't found anyone matching the description I gave. The man had vanished as quickly as he had appeared. That night was the scariest experience of my life. If that woman hadn't been there, I don't know what would have happened. I'm incredibly grateful to her and thankful that nothing worse occurred. It was a turning point in how I view personal safety. Before that night, I never thought about how vulnerable I could be. Now, I always keep my guard up, even in familiar places.